This is the Greek goddess Artemis, known as Diana by the Romans, and this statue, the Diana of Versailles, captures what many Greeks and Romans imagined her to look like: an athletic hunter. She's mid-stride, her short tunic flowing as if she's in motion. Reaching for her quiver of arrows, she's ready to chase down her prey. The statue epitomizes the interpretation of Artemis as the goddess of the hunt, protector of wildlife, and a symbol of virginity and chastity. And this is also the Greek goddess Artemis. Something looks different. Several somethings. Located today in the Ephesus Archaeological Museum, this statue of Artemis stands stiffly upright, with her legs tightly together. Her upper arms are against her body, with her lower arms reaching forward in a highly formalized gesture. She's draped not in a short tunic, but in a tight, elaborate gown covered in lions and bulls. Around her neck are ornate necklaces. Her crown is a towering headdress, and around her torso are rows of, let's call them bulbs, appendages, protuberances. While they're often interpreted as breasts, no one really knows what they represent. This is Artemis of Ephesus, a different form of the goddess who was worshipped in the city of Ephesus and beyond. She's not the athletic huntress you might expect from Greek mythology, but a powerful protector and provider for her city. For the better part of a millennium, the people of Ephesus worshipped her, showing their devotion to her by building the massive Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So how did Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, transform into Ephesian Artemis? What does this unique version of the goddess tell us about the religious life of Ephesus? And yes, we're going to answer the question, are these really breasts? Ephesus was an ancient Greek city located on the shores of the Aegean Sea in western Asia Minor, now modern-day Turkey. The city traces its roots back to Greek settlements from as early as the 10th century BCE. Hundreds of years later, in 133 BCE, it was incorporated into the Roman Republic, and within 200 years after that, Ephesus grew to be one of the largest cities in the entire Roman Empire. It was a commercial powerhouse, where trade routes across Anatolia would converge. The Roman geographer Strabo declared that Ephesus is the greatest place of trade of all the cities of Asia west of the Taurus Mountains. Ephesus is an absolutely stunning place, definitely in my top 3 favorite archaeological sites I've ever visited. Though I can't say the same for her temple. Ephesus was probably most famous for its gigantic temple of Artemis, also known as the Artemision. But it's not much to look at today. The temple was destroyed in late antiquity, and its stones were used for building materials around town. Why spend all the time and energy to quarry new marble when there's a huge, easily accessible pile of rubble that you could pillage? For example, blocks from the temple have been found built into the walls of the nearby Church of St. John. But in its heyday, the Artemision was huge, over 100 meters long and 20 meters tall. I'm tiny compared to the only pillar still standing, and the Roman historian Pliny the Elder says there were 127 of these pillars. If you want to get a good idea of what the Temple of Artemis might have originally looked like, I'd suggest checking out the nearby Temple of Apollo at Didyma, south of Ephesus. The worship of Ephesian Artemis might have started when Greek settlers first arrived in the region, but we don't have any solid evidence for that. What we do know is that some sort of sanctuary already existed here during the 10th century. Archaeologists have found ritual vessels and a mix of animal bones and ash, suggesting that animal sacrifices were already happening here. Though it's hard to say if this early sanctuary was dedicated to a goddess in general or to Artemis specifically at this time. A proper temple dedicated to her was built in the 500s BCE under the Lydian king Croesus, but it was destroyed by a fire in 356 BCE. The Ephesians rebuilt it on the same site, and from that point on, for nearly a millennium, this massive temple became the heart of the worship of Artemis, and one of the most famous religious structures in the entire Mediterranean world. One Ephesian inscription even called it the ornament of the whole province. The Greek geographer Pausanias noted that the sheer size of the temple helped spread her worship far and wide. He wrote, "But all cities worship Artemis of Ephesus, and individuals hold her in honor above all the gods." And he wasn't wrong. Her worship wasn't just limited to the city of Ephesus. Over 50 cities in Anatolia featured images of her on their coinage, and evidence for her worship has been found throughout the Roman Empire. For example, there was even a temple dedicated to Ephesian Artemis in Massilia, modern-day Marseille on the southern coast of France. In many ways, she became a pan-Roman deity, one of several Eastern-inspired gods that gained popularity across the Roman Empire, like Isis and Mithras. For the Ephesians, though, the Temple of Artemis was central to their city's identity. The Artemision and the symbols tied to Artemis, like the bee, were stamped on Ephesian coins, showing off the city's special connection to the goddess and her sacred temple. Statues of Artemis often depicted her wearing a crown shaped like city walls, symbolizing her role as the city's protector and thus connecting the goddess with the city's prosperity. And the Artemision wasn't just a place for sacrifices to Artemis. The complex included a gymnasium, a banqueting hall, and even served as a financial institution, acting as a bank and depository for the city, making it a central hub for both religious and civic life. The Artemision was also the start and end point for major festival parades or processions. We know a lot about these events thanks to this, the Salutaris inscription, a massive inscription discovered on the south entrance of the Ephesian theater. It describes a huge financial gift from a local official named Caius Vibius Salutaris and outlines a carefully planned religious procession honoring the goddess. Salutaris was super rich, and he donated a gigantic fortune to fund cash handouts during the festival of Artemis's birthday on May 6th. He also commissioned a few dozen statues of Artemis that were carried in a grand parade, from the Artemision to the theater, then back to the Artemision. The inscription is basically a set of stage directions detailing how the procession should unfold, basically making a big loop through the city. Salutaris insisted that these processions should be repeated regularly, during new moon sacrifices, athletic competitions, and festivals. They probably became woven into daily life. Let's say you're a shopkeeper sitting in your shop, and once again, there goes Artemis walking on by. Ritual processions like these were not unique to Ephesus. They've been a staple of religious life in cities throughout history. These are carefully choreographed events, usually involving religious leaders or city officials carrying sacred objects, icons, or statues through the city streets, stopping at key locations like temples, marketplaces, or theaters. Religious rituals always serve a function in society, but processions in particular, as very public parades, do a lot of heavy lifting. They can foster social cohesion and a sense of collective identity, basically making you feel more patriotic about Ephesus. But they also can remind you who's in charge. The grand parades organized by Salutaris were not just about honoring Artemis. They were also very public displays of his wealth and influence, cementing his status in the community while tying himself to the city's patron goddess. And Artemis found herself wrapped up in city politics all the time. For example, let's consider these two statues that I've shown a few times now. These are the so-called Beautiful Artemis and the Great Artemis, both now located in the Ephesus Archaeological Museum. You might assume they were discovered in the Artemision, but they were not. They were actually discovered in a public building right in the middle of the city, the Prytaneon, which served a dual religious and political function, both as the seat of the city's government and as a sacred building in its own right. Inscriptions from the reign of Caesar Augustus reveal that a cadre of priests called the Curetes were transferred from the Artemision to the Prytaneon, which was a pretty big power move. The historian Guy Rogers explains that this shift essentially handed control over some of Artemis's most important rituals to the city leadership. They now had the authority to decide not only how these rituals would be performed, but also who got to perform them. And when archaeologists excavated the Prytaneon in the 1950s, they found 4 statues of Artemis that had originally been displayed in the building's courtyard and main hall. Both the Beautiful Artemis and the Great Artemis show just how much the Ephesian government was willing to invest in her worship. These statues are huge, made of fine white marble, and must have cost a fortune to create. The city would not have gone through all that trouble unless Artemis's cult was thriving. On top of that, there's evidence that the cult of Artemis expanded after the move of the Curetes to the Prytaneon. The institution brought on more staff, doubled the sacrifices, and started receiving more and bigger donations, like the one from Salutaris, which expanded the civic rituals. All of this points to a huge increase in activity and revenue for the Artemis institution in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. It's also at this time that we get clear evidence that the worship of Ephesian Artemis now involved initiation, in the sense of joining a mystery cult. If you've seen my video on Isis, you'll know that mystery religions or mystery cults were religious groups in the ancient Greco-Roman world where membership required ritualized initiation to join. These rituals often included purification practices like abstaining from certain foods, alcohol, or sex, and members usually had financial obligations such as paying dues or covering the cost of the items needed for the ceremonies. Mystery religions were also known for their secrecy. The teachings and many of the rituals were kept under wraps and shared only with initiated members. Famous ones include the Mysteries of Isis and the Mysteries of Mithras. Now, the worship of Ephesian Artemis likely involved aspects of a mystery cult for centuries, but we don't get hard evidence for this until an inscription was discovered dating to the end of the 1st century that mentions a special priest, called a hierophant, who in other Greek cities was the chief priest that revealed secret teachings to initiates of mystery religions. This indicates that the Ephesians were celebrating rituals that closely paralleled the characteristics of other ancient mystery cults. But in this case, the mysteries of Artemis were very public, integrated into the civic and religious life of Ephesus. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the institutional worship of Artemis in Ephesus, but what about the goddess herself? What's her story? If you're a Greek mythology nerd, you might be familiar with her backstory. She's the twin sister of Apollo and the daughter of Zeus and her mother Leto. According to Greek mythology, like in the story described in the hymn to Delos by the Greek poet Callimachus, Zeus's wife Hera became enraged when she learned that Leto was pregnant with Zeus's children. She banned any land from offering Leto refuge to give birth. Finally, Leto reached the small rocky island of Delos, who defied Hera by offering Leto sanctuary. There, Artemis was born, and shortly after, Artemis helped her mother deliver her twin brother Apollo. And Delos goes down into history as one of the major cultic centers of Artemis in antiquity. But Ephesian Artemis had a different rival backstory. According to the Ephesians, she was born in the sacred grove of Ortygia, about 5 miles south of Ephesus. The Roman geographer Strabo describes how Hera was trying to spy on Leto giving birth when a group of guardians called the Curetes clashed their weapons so loudly that they scared her off. Notice that this is the same name adopted by the College of Priests who ran the mysteries of Artemis. The Ephesians were well aware that this was a rival birth story, and the Roman historian Tacitus says that a delegation of Ephesians even spoke before the Roman Senate, trying to discredit the Delos origin story in an effort to curry imperial favor, declaring Apollo and Diana were not, as commonly supposed, born at Delos. And as we've seen, she not only had a different backstory, but Ephesian Artemis also had a different appearance, breaking notably from the typical appearance of the huntress. So what do we make of this unconventional portrayal? The imagery likely reflects influence from local Anatolian religion. For example, the large headdress often depicts city walls, which represents her protection of Ephesus. This may stem from similar iconography seen elsewhere in Asia Minor, like the goddess Cybele, an Anatolian mother goddess. The animal imagery on Artemis may also originate from pre-Greek traditions. The scholar Sarah Morris argues that the bee, for example, found on some images of her dress as well as on some of her coinage, likely draws inspiration from Hittite mythology, an Anatolian civilization that thrived in the late Bronze Age. And finally, there are the bulbs on her chest and torso. Depending on the statue, they range from 15 to 25 of them, and scholars simply don't know what they represent. It's very common to interpret them as breasts, arguing they represent Artemis's role as a fertility goddess who nurtures her followers. This here is a modern sculpture of Artemis following that interpretation. But this idea only first appears among ancient Christian writers. For example, the early Christian apologist Minucius Felix points out the two forms of Artemis. Sometimes she is a huntress with her robe girded up high, and as the Ephesian, she has many and fruitful breasts. But his commentary appears in a polemical paragraph insulting pagan gods. Felix mocks the myths surrounding gods like Isis and Jupiter, portraying them as tragic, flawed, and even ridiculous. And he goes on to attack the physical depictions of gods, pointing out that their peculiar features represent their flawed characters. The whole point of the paragraph is to expose what Felix views as the irrationality and moral failings of Greek and Roman gods, and to contrast them with what he perceives as the coherence and dignity of Christianity. In other words, he is hardly an unbiased source, and the multi-breast theory can't be traced to earlier, more reliable witnesses. So there are some serious reasons to doubt that they represent her breasts. First of all, it seems that the ancient sculptors didn't consider the bulbs to be part of her body. For example, statues of Artemis like the Farnese Artemis in Naples or this figurine from the Getty Museum depict her exposed body as bronze, and her clothing as carved from marble or alabaster. Notice here that her face, hands, hair, and feet are bronze, while everything else is white, which seems to indicate that the bulbs were considered part of her adornment, not her body. Moreover, these bulbs also appear on male gods, like Zeus Labrandeus, the chief god of the nearby city of Mylassa, located only about 120 kilometers from Ephesus. So it seems, along with her city wall crown, that the bulbs around her chest and torso stem from local traditions that were adopted into Artemis's better-known Greco-Roman iconography, from both male and female Anatolian deities. Another popular explanation for the objects is that they are bull testicles. According to this theory, devotees would have detached the scrotums of bulls as part of sacrifices to Artemis, and then hung them on the wooden statue of the goddess to imbue her with fertility and procreative strength. As one author puts it, their relative size and shape match bulls' testicles.
Hey everyone, Andrew here. Now, I'm a YouTuber committed to delivering accurate content about religion, so when I read this statement, I found myself in the position of Googling bulls' testicles to fact check it. My search history has never been so questionable. If you appreciate the lengths I go to for the sake of educational accuracy, sacrifices that now include an intimate familiarity with the primary reproductive organs of cattle, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. A little tip thrown in the tip jar to support this long-suffering researcher in the trenches of Google Images. Back to the show.
However, bull sacrifices for Artemis are not well attested. Archaeologists have not found a ton of male cattle bones at the Temple of Artemis that would indicate this was a primary part of her worship, nor are there any historical records or inscriptions describing bull sacrifices or bull scrotums as part of the rituals honoring her. Now, to be fair, some scholars have countered that we're talking about testicles from bulls that have been castrated, but not necessarily killed, which wouldn't have left any trace in the archaeological record. Moreover, sacred castration was sort of a thing among the major cults of Anatolia. Eunuch priests served at the Temple of Artemis, as well as at the sanctuary of Cybele at Pessinus, a few hundred kilometers northeast of Ephesus. So some scholars still hold to this theory, and it would again point to the local influence from Anatolian religion. Others have suggested that the bulbs may descend from the Anatolian practice of hanging animal skin pouches called kursha, which appear in Hittite mythologies and were sometimes included in pre-Greek imagery as a bag with a strap-like handle, which could be hung on a branch or peg. The old Hittite myth of the god Telepinu describes the kursha as a sheepskin bag suspended from a tree, filled with symbols of fertility and agrarian goods like wine. In support of this theory, the historian Roger Woodard describes them as kind of like a cornucopia, a symbol of abundance and plenty. Scholars have also suggested there may be a connection between the bulbs and amber pendants that have been found at the Artemision. Hundreds of amber beads and pendants have been found here, most dating to the geometric period between 900 and 700 BCE. And a few dozen of them resemble the size and shape of the objects we see here on her torso. Many of them appear to have been pierced in order to be suspended, perhaps somehow affixed or hung on a wooden statue of Artemis as some kind of votive offering. The scholar Anton Baumer theorizes they may have been strung together as a necklace or girdle that would have been hung on the statue. Whatever we make of the bulbs on Artemis's torso, the breast theory seems to be the least likely. Whether they represent bull scrotums, amber pendants, or Anatolian ritual pouches, it's more likely that her imagery draws on local indigenous traditions that were fused with the figure of the Greek Artemis. As is the case in religious practices all over the world, Greco-Roman religion was often a hybrid enterprise, combining elements from the various cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, in this case with the local traditions of Anatolia. Okay, so far we've learned that Artemis was not just a patron to the people of Ephesus. She was central to their civic identity and culture. Her temple wasn't just a place of worship, but a symbol of Ephesus, a source of pride that made Ephesian Artemis known across the empire. All of this gives some cultural context for a dramatic story found in the New Testament, and a clash between the Ephesians and early Christians. According to the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul had been spreading his message across the eastern Mediterranean with some success, but he hit some opposition in Ephesus. A local silversmith named Demetrius, who was connected with the Temple of Artemis, organized a revolt against Paul. Two of Paul's companions were arrested, and suddenly Paul's mission to Ephesus was in serious trouble. According to the story, Demetrius and other artisans perceived Paul's teachings as a threat to Artemis and her temple, and this would imperil their livelihood. They were craftsmen who made statues and other objects to sell at the temple, so any decline in the worship of Artemis means a decline in business. To deal with the perceived threat, the Ephesians put Paul's companions on public trial in the Grand Theater of Ephesus. The crowd repeatedly shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," as they harassed the missionaries. Luckily for Paul and his companions, they escaped unharmed. Demetrius and his fellow artisans are set up as the bad guys of the story. The Book of Acts suggests that their revolt was driven by selfish economic concerns. But considering what we now know about the importance of Artemis to Ephesus, it's easy to imagine that the threat went much deeper than just their wallets. Gods like Artemis were essentially the guarantors of the prosperity of Greco-Roman cities. Her temple institution was intertwined with local politics, like what we've seen with Salutaris and moving the Curetes to the Prytaneon. Exclusive monotheism as preached by early Christians imperiled the very civic, political, and yes, economic foundations of cities like Ephesus. In the long run, the centrality of Artemis in Ephesus faded. For its part, the Artemisians survived as an important center of religious practice well into the 3rd century CE, though it was eventually destroyed by a double catastrophe in the year 262, first by a huge earthquake and then by Gothic forces who invaded the city and plundered the temple. The institutional worship of Artemis may have continued for another century or so, but the temple itself ceased to be a center of practice and civic identity and was never rebuilt. Ephesus would continue to be a major religious center in Asia Minor, but this time for Christianity instead of Artemis. The city came to be associated with the Apostle John, who was purportedly buried in the nearby Basilica of St. John, which stands in ruins just a few minutes away from the Temple of Artemis, built in part with blocks plundered from the temple. Despite its destruction, the Temple of Artemis lived on in the imaginations of Christian writers. In late antiquity and the medieval period, the destruction of the temple was erroneously attributed to early Christian saints, such as the Apostle John, who, according to legend, single-handedly toppled the temple. In these stories, the destruction of the great Temple of Artemis served as an image of Christianity's triumph over traditional Greco-Roman religions. But while so many stories focus on the decline and fall of Ephesian Artemis, I think there's value in taking a page from Guy Rogers' book on the goddess. The story of the mysteries of Artemis is a story of almost unimaginable success. The worship of Ephesian Artemis lasted 600 years and forged the identity of one of the most famous cities of the entire Roman Empire. To quote Dr. Rogers, "If that is religious failure, seldom can a cult have failed so successfully." Much of this video comes from my own on-location footage that I filmed just a few months ago in Western Turkey. This was a profoundly meaningful trip because I was revisiting places that shaped my own academic and personal connection to early Christianity. See, back in the spring of 2013, I basically went on the exact same trip on a study tour for my PhD program. Now, I say tour, but it was technically a class I was taking for academic credit, a class called The Archaeology of Early Christianity. But instead of a classroom, we went to the actual sites we were studying. We, of course, went to the famous sites. We drove to Ephesus and saw the Library of Celsus and the ruins of the Temple of Artemis. But we also went to archaeological sites that tourists almost never go to, like the ancient city of Priene. And I can say without exaggerating that this trip changed my life. This was my second semester in grad school. I was just a baby academic, the before the beard era. And here I was walking through a residential district of an ancient city. Priene is amazingly preserved. And even though the site was basically empty, I was just there with a dozen grad students, I could almost feel the daily rhythms of religious life in the ancient world. And it's a little cringy to say it, but this moved me. And I went on to dedicate the next 6 years of my life in that PhD program studying popular religion in the late Roman Empire, the religion of the ordinary person. And I want you to experience that feeling, the moment when history feels real and immediate. It's one thing to read about these places, but being there, walking the same streets, makes it all feel tangible in a way that a book or a YouTube video never can. So I'm absolutely thrilled to announce I'll be leading our first Religion for Breakfast study tour, and I'm basing it off of this PhD level class I took 10 years ago. It'll be a 7-day tour from May 25th to the 31st, with a busy itinerary visiting archaeological sites all over Western Turkey. I will be your personal tour guide for the entire trip. As a scholar specializing in late antique religion, I've been studying this region for years, and I've been studying how people actually lived and practiced their faith in the ancient world. Not just the big theological debates over the Trinity or the nature of Jesus, but the everyday realities of religious life in the late Roman Empire. This tour is not just about seeing ruins, it's about understanding the people who used to live and worship there. I'll walk you through temples, synagogues, and churches, explaining how these spaces were used, how different religious communities interacted, and how Christianity took root in this region. We'll visit Ephesus and stand in the theater made famous in the book of Acts. We'll visit the great Temple of Apollo at Didyma, where you can literally walk right on through the temple into the inner sanctuary. And yes, if you feel so compelled as I did, you can hug the pillars. I made sure to recreate this picture from my first trip when I revisited Didyma 10 years later. We'll also see Pamukkale, which is famous for its white travertine terraces. But because we're all about archaeology here, the main event will be touring the ancient city Hierapolis right above the terraces. The highlight here is the Plutonion, a mysterious sanctuary dedicated to Pluto, god of the underworld. We'll also visit the Synagogue of Sardis, the largest ancient synagogue ever discovered, as well as the Red Basilica near Pergamon, which may be a temple to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. Oh, and you'll get to eat a bunch of Turkish food. If you've never had Turkish breakfast, that will arguably be more life-changing than these archaeological sites. I joke, but not really. You know I love breakfast, right? Overall, I hope this tour will be more than just an opportunity to learn about early Christianity and how it was embedded in its cultural context in Western Anatolia. It will certainly be that. I will be lecturing at every site. We'll be chatting about the scholarship over some kebab. You will learn a ton, but my real hope is that you will feel ancient religion come alive, get a visceral sense of daily life and community in antiquity. Now, if you want to learn more, I go over a full breakdown of the itinerary, logistics, and everything else you need to know in a separate video. Click the link in the description below to watch it. I'll be holding a live Q&A session very soon, so keep an eye out for that announcement. And if you've already made up your mind, you can register at religionforbreakfast.com. This will redirect you to the page for Sacred Space Tours. This is the tour agency I've been working with. They are some wonderful people who have worked with scholars such as Dr. Dan McClellan of TikTok fame. Registration will close in early March, and space is limited. I know it's a quick turnaround, and I wish we had more time and more space, but we want to keep this group small to create a tight-knit learning community where everyone can fully engage with the sites and with each other. So again, links are pinned in the comments below, and I hope to see you in Turkey.